Hello, my dear friends. In medieval Europe, justice was not hidden behind walls or papers. It was shown openly, in town squares and on wooden platforms, where the whole community could see the law carried out with their own eyes. At the center of this scene stood one of the most feared and isolated figures in society, the executioner. His job was simple in purpose but heavy in meaning. He was the man who ended lives in the name of the law. Yet this duty did not bring honor or comfort. It brought loneliness, suspicion, and a life lived at the edge of society. The executioner was usually appointed by a town or lord and paid to perform punishments that others refused to do. These punishments included beheading, hanging, burning, whipping, and breaking on the wheel. The methods depended on local laws and the crime committed. Murderers, thieves, traitors, and heretics all faced different deaths. The executioner had to know how to carry out each sentence correctly. A mistake could cause terrible suffering and anger the crowd. If a beheading was slow or clumsy, people blamed the executioner, not the law. This made the job terrifying. Every public punishment was a test of skill under the eyes of hundreds of watching faces. Despite working for the law, executioners were not treated as respected officials. They were seen as unclean. Medieval people believed that contact with death and blood carried spiritual and physical pollution. Because the executioner touched the bodies of criminals and dealt with violence, many believed his presence brought bad luck. He was often forced to live outside the town walls or in a separate part of the city. His house was avoided. His family was feared. Children of executioners were shunned at school and in markets. Marriage outside the executioner's family line was rare, because other families did not want their blood mixed with what they saw as a cursed trade. Social life for an executioner was almost non-existent. He could not sit freely in taverns or attend celebrations without drawing stares. People needed him, but they did not welcome him. During the day of an execution, the crowd demanded his presence. After the execution, they wanted him gone. He stood between law and death, but belonged to neither world fully. He was not a criminal, but he was not treated as a normal citizen either. Training for the job often passed from father to son. This was not because families wanted the role, but because no one else would take it. A young boy born into an executioner's family grew up knowing his future. He learned how to sharpen blades, how to tie ropes, and how to prepare bodies. He also learned how to endure isolation. From childhood, he felt the weight of his family name. He knew that other children would avoid him and that his work would never bring pride. The tools of the executioner were symbols of fear. Swords, axes, ropes, and wheels were kept in his care. He had to maintain them and bring them to the square when ordered. His clothing was often marked so people could identify him. In some places, he wore specific colors or signs of his trade. These marks made it impossible to hide. Everyone knew who he was. Everywhere he went, his role followed him. Religion added another layer of burden. Medieval Christianity taught forgiveness and mercy, yet also supported punishment for crime. The executioner existed in this contradiction. He carried out death sentences, but he was also seen as sinful for doing so. Some believed that even though he acted under law, his soul was stained by the blood he spilled. Many executioners sought forgiveness through prayer and church donations, hoping to protect themselves from spiritual punishment. Yet even in church, they were often given separate seating, away from ordinary people. Economically, the executioner lived in an uncertain place. He was paid by the town or lord, sometimes in money and sometimes in goods. He might also receive the clothes of the executed or parts of their property as payment. In some regions, he was allowed to sell the bodies of criminals to doctors or use their fat for medicines and ointments believed to heal wounds. These practices, while accepted, increased the sense that his work was dark and unnatural. His income came from death, and everyone knew it. Fear of the executioner was mixed with a strange dependence. People wanted justice for crimes, but they did not want to take part in the killing. The executioner became the tool that allowed others to remain clean. He absorbed the violence of the system so that society could pretend to be orderly and moral. In this way, he carried a burden meant for the whole community, yet he carried it alone. On execution days, the town square became a stage. Merchants sold food. Children climbed onto walls. Prisoners were brought out in chains. The executioner waited, sometimes hooded, sometimes barefaced. His movements were watched closely. The crowd expected him to act with speed and strength. A clean death was considered a sign of skill. A slow death caused anger and even riots. If the executioner failed, he could be beaten by the crowd or punished by authorities. His own safety depended on his precision. After the crowd dispersed, the executioner returned to his lonely home. There was no celebration, no thanks, no comfort. The job left physical and mental marks. Repeated exposure to death hardened some, but troubled others. Medieval records speak of executioners who drank heavily or lived in deep isolation. Their lives were shaped by an endless cycle of preparation, performance, and rejection. To live as a medieval executioner meant standing at the crossroads of law and death every day. It meant being needed and hated at the same time. It meant carrying out the will of judges while being treated as if you were guilty yourself. The town relied on your hands, but did not want to touch you in return. Survival did not depend on respect, but on obedience and skill. And as the story of this harsh profession begins, it becomes clear that being an executioner was not a position of power, but a sentence of its own. A sentence of isolation, fear, and lifelong burden, passed down through families who could not escape it. This was the first part of a life spent serving justice while never being allowed to join the society that demanded it. As the life of a medieval executioner continued beyond the public square, the true hardship of the role revealed itself in the quiet hours between punishments. While crowds only saw him on days of execution, his daily existence was shaped by rules and fears that never disappeared. He lived with the knowledge that his presence made others uncomfortable. In many towns, he was forbidden from living near the market or church. His house stood near gallows hills, waste grounds, or city edges, close to the places of death and refuse. This physical distance mirrored his social distance. Neighbors avoided his door. Children were warned not to play near his home. Even when he walked through town to buy food, sellers often placed goods on the ground rather than into his hands, avoiding direct contact as if his touch carried corruption. Family life did not protect him from this treatment. His wife and children shared his isolation. A daughter of an executioner struggled to find a husband outside the executioner class. A son was expected to follow the same trade, not because he wished to, but because other trades would not accept him. Guilds of bakers, tailors, and smiths refused to train children from executioner families. These families became closed circles, marrying among themselves or with other outcast groups such as gravediggers and tanners. Over generations, this created lines of people trapped in a profession they did not choose. The work of death became a family inheritance. Daily duties went beyond killing. The executioner also handled torture, branding, and public humiliation punishments. He whipped criminals, cut off hands, burned symbols into skin, and placed offenders in stocks and pillories. He was also responsible for cleaning up after executions. He removed bodies from gallows, washed blood from platforms, and buried or sold the remains when allowed. In some towns, he collected stray animals or disposed of carcasses. All tasks involving impurity were given to him. Society used him as a tool to deal with what it did not want to touch. Knowledge of anatomy became part of his craft. He learned where to strike to kill quickly and where to strike to cause pain without death. This knowledge was practical, not medical. A well-trained executioner knew how to sever the head with one clean blow. He also knew how to keep a prisoner alive through long punishment if ordered. These skills were passed through practice and observation, not books. Mistakes were remembered by towns for years. A failed execution became a story of horror, and the executioner's name was cursed long after. Religion deepened the burden of the job. Before an execution, priests urged prisoners to confess and repent. The executioner stood nearby as both instrument of law and witness to final prayers. Some believed that killing, even under orders, endangered the soul. Executioners often sought forgiveness through church donations or pilgrimages, yet many priests refused them normal confession or burial rites. In death, an executioner might be buried in an unmarked grave or in ground separate from others. Even in the afterlife, he was kept apart. Fear of revenge also shaped his life. Families of the executed sometimes blamed him personally rather than the court. Threats were common. Some executioners traveled with guards or carried weapons for protection. Others wore masks or hoods to hide their faces, though many townspeople knew exactly who they were. Living among anger and fear made every punishment day dangerous. A crowd that wanted justice could quickly turn into a mob if anger rose too high. Economically, the executioner's income depended on how often the law was enforced. In times of peace, work was rare and money small. In times of unrest, his work increased, but so did risk and hatred. Payment might include coins, clothing of the dead, or the right to sell pieces of rope or wood from the gallows as charms. People believed these objects carried power. This strange trade mixed fear with superstition, making the executioner both despised and secretly useful. His role in public ceremony also trapped him in contradiction. During executions, he stood before crowds as the visible hand of justice. He raised the sword, pulled the rope, or turned the wheel. Yet after the act, he was treated as if he were the criminal. The same people who demanded punishment refused to share a table with him. The law needed his strength, but society rejected his presence. The mental weight of this life cannot be separated from its duties. Repeated exposure to suffering and death shaped his mind. Some executioners became hardened and silent. Others drank heavily. Some tried to find meaning in skill, believing that a quick death was a form of mercy. Yet the job offered no escape from its image. A man could change towns, but his reputation followed him. Records listed him as executioner. His tools marked him. His family name revealed him. To live as a medieval executioner was to exist in permanent contradiction. He was necessary but unwanted, powerful but powerless, visible but untouchable. The law spoke through his hands, yet he was treated as if the crime belonged to him. Every execution renewed his isolation. Every punishment reminded him that society needed him only at the moment of death. And as his life continued from one sentence to the next, it became clear that the worst part of the job was not the act of killing itself, but the endless separation that followed it. The executioner did not simply end lives. He lived one of his own, cut off from the world he served, bound to a role that no one else would take and punished not by courts but by society itself. As the executioner's life moved forward from one sentence to the next, the burden of his role grew heavier with time. The town remembered every mistake he made. If his hand slipped during a beheading, or if a rope failed to kill quickly, the story spread through markets and taverns. Years later, people still spoke of the day when death came too slowly. The executioner's reputation was built not on kindness or fairness, but on how cleanly he could end a life. Skill was his only protection, yet even skill did not bring respect. It only reduced anger. The tools of his trade shaped his daily routine. He sharpened swords and axes with great care, knowing that a dull blade meant suffering and danger. He checked ropes for strength and repaired wooden frames and wheels. These preparations were done in private places, away from public eyes. Many towns required him to store his tools outside the main streets, close to gallows hills or waste grounds. Children were warned not to touch these tools, and adults avoided them as if they carried a curse. Even objects connected to the executioner were feared. His clothing often marked him clearly. In some regions, he wore special colors or symbols so that people could recognize him instantly. This made hiding impossible. When he entered a market, silence followed. People stepped aside. Conversations stopped. The executioner could not blend into a crowd. His job followed him like a shadow. This constant visibility made loneliness deeper. He was always known, but never welcomed. The legal system depended on him not only for death, but for confession. Torture was part of medieval justice, and the executioner often served as torturer. Prisoners were stretched, beaten, or burned to force them to speak. The executioner had to know how to cause pain without killing too quickly. This placed him at the center of fear long before execution day. Prisoners saw him as the face of suffering. Even when a man confessed, he often blamed the executioner rather than the judges who ordered it. Public executions were designed as lessons. Crowds gathered not only to watch but to learn what happened to lawbreakers. The executioner's movements were slow and formal, following ritual. He led the condemned to the platform. He raised his weapon. He carried out the sentence. Every motion was watched. If he hesitated, the crowd shouted. If he was too rough, they shouted. The space allowed for no error. His body became part of the law's performance. Yet after the crowd left, he remained behind to finish the work. He took down bodies, cleaned blood from wood and stone, and prepared remains for burial or sale. These tasks were done alone or with a few helpers from outcast families. No one praised him for this labor. It was expected and forgotten. The square that had been filled with noise returned to silence, and the executioner walked home alone. His home life reflected this separation. Guests were rare. Meals were eaten in quiet rooms. His children learned early that other children would not play with them. His wife shopped at times when markets were empty. Weddings and funerals were small and closed. Even celebrations inside the family were cautious because joy displayed too openly drew attention. Some executioners tried to escape their fate. They moved to new towns or hid their past. But records followed them, and their skills revealed them. A man who knew how to handle rope and blade too well was soon recognized. The trade could not be unlearned. Once marked, always marked. There were moments when society needed him beyond punishment. During plagues, he removed bodies. During wars, he dealt with captured criminals. During unrest, he enforced new laws. Each crisis increased his work and danger. Each crisis also deepened fear of him. People blamed him for pain they could not control. In religion, he stood in a strange position. He worked for justice, yet he dealt in death. Some priests refused him communion. Others offered prayers for his soul. He lived with uncertainty about his place in the next world. He knew that people whispered about his fate after death, believing that his hands were stained forever. To live as a medieval executioner meant living in a narrow space between necessity and rejection. He could not leave his role, but he could never fully belong to the world that needed him. His life was shaped by fear, routine, and the weight of other people's crimes. Every day he prepared for another moment when he would stand before a crowd and end a life, knowing that once it was done, he would return again to silence and distance. And so the days passed for the executioner, measured not in seasons or harvests, but in sentences and punishments. His world was one of sharp tools, fixed rituals, and heavy memory. In serving the law, he lost his place among the living. He survived not through honor, but through endurance, carrying the work of death in a society that demanded it, yet refused to share its burden. As the years passed, the executioner's life became a long lesson in patience and isolation. Time did not soften society's view of him. Instead, it hardened into tradition. Children grew up hearing that the executioner was dangerous to touch, dangerous to speak to, dangerous even to look at too long. These fears were passed from one generation to the next, just like the executioner's own trade was passed down inside his family. The job did not end when one man grew old. It waited for his son or his nephew or another outcast child who had no other path open to him. The executioner's work was not limited to death sentences alone. He also carried out lesser punishments meant to shame rather than kill. Thieves were whipped in public. Cheaters were branded with hot iron. Women accused of immoral behavior might be shaved or displayed in stocks. These acts were meant to teach lessons to the crowd. The executioner became the arm of public shame as much as public death. His hands did not only end lives, they marked bodies and memories. Crowds treated these events as both warning and entertainment. Market stalls opened near the gallows. People ate and drank while waiting for punishment to begin. Children climbed onto walls to see better. Laughter sometimes mixed with fear. Yet when the executioner stepped forward, silence fell. All eyes followed him. In that moment, he held the town's attention more than any lord or priest. Still, this attention did not turn into respect. It vanished the moment the punishment ended. Afterwards, people avoided him even more strongly. They believed that witnessing pain made them unclean for a short time, and touching the man who caused it would make them unclean for longer. The executioner became something like a walking reminder of blood and death. He carried the memory of the crime and the punishment with him wherever he went. Some towns forced executioners to perform other dirty tasks as part of their contract. They cleaned latrines, removed animal carcasses, and buried plague victims. Society pushed everything it feared or despised into his hands. In this way, he became responsible not only for criminals but for death itself in all its forms. When disease spread, he was called. When animals died in the streets, he was called. When bodies lay unclaimed, he was called. Because of this, people believed he possessed strange powers. Superstition grew around him. Some thought his touch could cure illness. Others believed his tools could bring luck or protection. Pieces of rope from hangings were sold as charms. Fat taken from executed bodies was used in folk medicine. Even blood from the scaffold was sometimes collected for magical use. These beliefs made the executioner both feared and secretly desired. People who would not sit near him might still buy a charm from his hand. The executioner's knowledge of pain made him useful in another dark way. Doctors and scholars sometimes asked for his help. He knew where bones broke and where muscles failed. He knew how long the body could endure. This knowledge helped early medical study, but it tied him even closer to death. Instead of healing, his experience came from harming. Even when he helped science, he remained outside society. Marriage remained difficult. A woman who married an executioner accepted a life of isolation. She was avoided by neighbors and watched by officials. Her children would carry the same mark. Some women married into these families out of poverty, others because their own families were already outcasts. Love may have existed, but it lived under heavy pressure. A family built around an executioner was never truly free. Old age brought no comfort. When an executioner became too weak to work, he faced poverty. Towns sometimes paid a small pension, but often they did not. A man who could no longer lift the sword lost his only skill. His children took over, or another outcast replaced him. There was no honor in retirement, only disappearance. Death did not release him from separation. Executioners were sometimes buried outside normal graveyards near the places where they worked. Their graves were not marked with pride. They were quiet and forgotten. Even in memory, society kept them apart. To live this life was to live as a tool rather than a person. The executioner was shaped by law, fear, and ritual. He stood at the center of public justice and at the edge of human contact. Every execution reminded him that he served a system that would never accept him. Every punishment renewed the wall between him and others. And as the long cycle of this harsh profession continued, it became clear that the true sentence of the executioner was not written by judges. It was written by custom. He was condemned not to die, but to live apart. To wake each day knowing he was needed, yet unwanted. To carry out the most final duty in society and then return to a life of silence and distance. As the executioner's life carried on through years of duty, the slow damage of the role became clearer, not in public moments, but in the quiet spaces between them. Long before the next execution day arrived, his mind was already shaped by what he would have to do again. The knowledge that another sentence would come never truly left him. While farmers waited for harvest and merchants waited for trade, the executioner waited for judgment days. His future was not marked by seasons, but by deaths yet to be carried out. In many towns, the executioner was forbidden from joining guilds or owning shops inside the main streets. This meant his chance to earn money outside executions was small. He could not easily become a baker or a tailor. His work defined him too completely. Even when no one was being punished, he remained the executioner in the eyes of others. His skill had no peaceful use. A sword meant for cutting heads could not be used for honest craft without fear and anger from neighbors. Public opinion also turned quickly against him when executions went wrong. If a rope snapped or a blade struck poorly, the crowd believed the executioner was cruel or careless. They did not blame the law that ordered death. They blamed the hand that carried it out. In some cases, crowds attacked executioners who failed to perform cleanly. Stones were thrown, fists were raised. Guards sometimes had to protect the man who was supposed to represent authority. His safety depended not only on the court, but on the mood of the people watching. The emotional cost of repeated killing could not be spoken about openly. There were no words for such pain in medieval society. There were only prayers and silence. Some executioners tried to separate their work from their thoughts, treating it as a mechanical duty. Others were haunted by faces and voices. They remembered prisoners who cried, begged, or prayed aloud. These sounds stayed with them long after the crowd went home. Yet there was no place to share this weight. No one wanted to hear the executioner's suffering. Even travel brought no relief. When he walked beyond town borders, people in nearby villages often knew who he was. Records were kept. Officials spoke to one another. A man with this trade could not easily start again. His tools marked him. His knowledge marked him. His family name marked him. He was tied to his profession as tightly as a criminal was tied to his crime. The executioner's role also placed him in a strange position with criminals themselves. Before death, prisoners sometimes spoke to him more honestly than to priests or judges. They asked questions. They begged for mercy he could not give. They asked for a quick death. This made the executioner both enemy and final companion. He stood beside the condemned at the last moment, hearing confessions and regrets that would never be written down. These private words became part of his memory, another burden carried alone. In times of unrest, his work increased. Wars, rebellions, and plagues filled prisons quickly. Courts moved faster. Sentences came more often. His arm tired. His spirit weakened. Each crisis turned him into a symbol of order restored through fear. Yet once peace returned, he was again pushed back into shadow. Society remembered him only when punishment was needed. His children inherited not only his work but his reputation. A son trained to hold the blade also learned to accept rejection. A daughter learned that marriage choices were few. These children grew up knowing that the world outside their home was closed to them. Their lives were shaped before they could choose them. In this way, the executioner's suffering did not end with him. It spread across generations. The town depended on him to complete its laws, yet it also feared that his presence reminded them of death and sin. They wanted justice, but they did not want to feel responsible for it. By pushing the executioner away, society pushed away its own violence. He became the mirror they refused to look into. He carried the stain of punishment so that others could feel clean. As years turned into decades, the executioner's life became a cycle without reward. Preparation, punishment, isolation, rest. Then preparation again. There was no promotion, no honor, no escape, only continuation. His name might be known, but it would never be celebrated. His work would be remembered only when something went wrong. To be a medieval executioner was not to be powerful, but to be trapped. Trapped between law and fear. Trapped between necessity and rejection. trapped inside a role that could not be put down at the end of the day. Every execution renewed the distance between him and the world. Every silence after reminded him that he would never fully belong. And as the years of this harsh duty stretched on, it became clear that the greatest punishment was not given to those on the scaffold alone. It was also given to the man who stood beside it, holding the blade. His life was shaped by death, yet he was forced to live on, carrying the memory of every sentence, every face, and every final moment in a society that demanded his service but denied him its warmth. As the executioner's life continued into later years, the slow weight of his profession pressed down not only on his body, but on his sense of being human among other humans. He lived in a town, yet never truly inside it. He heard church bells, market cries, and festival songs, but he stood apart from them, like a figure behind glass. When people spoke of law and order, they spoke as if he were only a tool, not a man with thoughts and fears of his own. In this way, the executioner slowly learned that his value was tied only to moments of punishment and nowhere else. The routine of justice shaped his weeks and months. A notice would arrive from the court, a sentence would be written, a date would be chosen. From that moment, preparation began. He sharpened blades until they shone. He checked ropes for strength. He inspected the platform where death would take place. These actions were careful and repeated, almost like prayer. Mistakes could bring chaos. A dull blade could bring screams. A weak rope could bring shame and danger. His work demanded precision, yet offered no praise for success, only blame for failure. When execution day came, the town transformed. Shops opened early, roads filled with people. The condemned was led out in chains. A priest walked beside him, murmuring final words. The executioner stood waiting. The crowd did not look at the judge. They looked at him. His hands became the focus of all attention. In that moment, he carried the anger, fear, and desire for justice of the entire town. If the prisoner died quickly, the crowd nodded and dispersed. If not, their anger turned toward the man with the blade. Afterward, the town returned to ordinary life. Children ran, merchants sold food, farmers returned to fields. Only the executioner remained in the shadow of what had happened. He cleaned the platform. He carried away the body. He washed blood from wood and stone. No one stayed to help him. No one thanked him. The law had been satisfied, and so had the crowd. His role was finished until the next sentence. Between executions, he lived in a quiet state of waiting. He did not belong to guilds or councils. He was not invited to weddings or feasts. When festivals came, he watched from a distance. He heard music without joining it. He saw dancers without touching the circle. His presence reminded others of fear and death, and so they kept him away from joy. In this way, happiness became something he observed, not something he shared. Superstition grew around him like a shadow. People whispered that his touch could bring sickness or bad luck. Others believed it could cure pain or bring strength. These beliefs made him both avoided and secretly used. A peasant might refuse to sit beside him, but still come at night to ask for a charm made from gallows rope. A mother might warn her child not to look at him, yet buy ointment made from a criminal's fat. The executioner became a figure of dark usefulness, half feared, half needed. His relationship with the church remained uncertain. He was required to attend services but often sat apart. Some priests offered prayers for his soul. Others avoided him. The executioner himself lived with doubt. He wondered whether killing under law still counted as sin. He wondered whether his work closed the door of heaven to him. To protect himself, he prayed often. He gave what money he could to the church. He hoped that obedience to law would count as obedience to God. Yet the doubt never fully left him. With age, the body weakened. Arms that once swung swords with strength grew stiff. Eyes that once judged distance grew less sharp. This frightened the executioner more than death itself. A weak arm meant a slow execution. A slow execution meant rage from the crowd. Rage meant danger. Old age did not bring rest. It brought fear of failure. Some towns replaced old executioners quickly. Others forced sons to take over while fathers still lived, turning family homes into places of training and tension. The next generation watched and learned. A boy saw his father sharpen blades and wash blood from wood. He learned that this was his future. He learned that other children would avoid him. He learned that marriage would be difficult. His path was already drawn. In this way, the executioner's burden did not die with him. It continued through bloodlines, becoming a chain of duty passed from hand to hand. The executioner also became a keeper of stories no one else wanted. He knew which men begged and which cursed. He knew which women fainted and which prayed. He heard last words that were never written down. These memories stayed with him. He carried them alone. There was no place to speak of them because no one wanted to listen to the voice of death. To live this life was to stand between the living and the dying every time the law demanded it. It was to be both servant and outcast. It was to touch the edge of death so often that the living world slowly pulled away. The executioner did not choose this path. It chose him through birth, poverty, or force. And as his days moved from one sentence to the next, the true meaning of his punishment became clear. He was not only the man who ended lives, he was the man who lived with their endings inside him. He walked among people who needed his work, but feared his presence. He served justice yet was never allowed to share in the peace it claimed to bring. As the executioner's life moved deeper into routine, the strange balance between fear and dependence grew even stronger. Towns needed him whenever law was broken, yet they wanted him invisible the rest of the time. He was called forward only when death or punishment was required. On ordinary days, he was expected to disappear. This created a life that was shaped by sudden moments of public attention, followed by long stretches of isolation. One day, hundreds of eyes would watch his hands. The next, no one would meet his gaze. The justice system relied on spectacle. Punishment had to be seen to be believed. The executioner's role was not only to kill or whip, but to make the sentence visible. His actions were meant to warn others. This placed enormous pressure on him to perform correctly, not just physically, but symbolically. A clean strike showed order. A failed strike suggested weakness in law itself. In this way, the executioner carried the image of authority on his shoulders, even though he had no real authority of his own. Because of this, he lived under constant judgment. Judges could blame him for disorder. Crowds could blame him for cruelty. Priests could blame him for sin. Even criminals blamed him for their fate. Everyone placed their anger somewhere, and that place was often the man with the blade. The executioner became a container for the fears and guilt of the entire town. He took in what others did not want to hold. The work itself demanded physical strength and steady nerves. Carrying bodies, lifting tools, standing for long hours in public cold or heat, and performing violent acts took a toll on the body. Many executioners suffered from injuries, stiff joints, and trembling hands. There was no healer for such damage. A man who could not lift a sword could not work. A man who could not work had no place. His usefulness was tied directly to his ability to cause harm when ordered. Daily life outside punishment days remained narrow. The executioner did not own land like farmers. He did not trade freely like merchants. He did not belong to guilds like craftsmen. His income depended on events that most people hoped would not happen. When crime was low, his pay was low. When unrest was high, his danger was high. There was no stable path, only waiting. Even when towns tried to treat executioners as officials, custom overpowered law. A contract could state his duties and wages, but it could not force people to accept him socially. He might be paid by the city, but he was still avoided in the street. He might serve the court, but he could not sit among judges. Paper gave him a role. Tradition gave him a wall. The place where he lived reflected this. His house was often near the gallows or outside the main gate. It was close to waste grounds and burial places. This meant that he lived beside the symbols of death every day. The smell of decay and the sight of empty fields or hanging posts became part of his view. Home was not a refuge. It was an extension of his work. Children growing up in such a house learned early what their family was. They learned not to invite friends home. They learned not to speak loudly in public. They learned that their name carried weight. A boy might dream of becoming a soldier or merchant, but doors closed before he reached them. His father's trade followed him like a shadow. Education could not change this. Skill could not change this. Birth decided more than effort. There were moments when the executioner tried to appear ordinary. He might attend church quietly. He might buy bread like any other man. He might greet neighbors politely. Yet these small actions did not change his place. People answered with short words. They moved aside. They remembered what he was. Ordinary behavior did not make him ordinary. The emotional burden grew heavier with every year. To witness suffering again and again without release shaped the mind. Some executioners became distant and cold. Others became nervous and restless. Sleep was not always peaceful. Dreams returned faces and cries. Yet there was no language for such pain. Medieval society did not speak of inner wounds. Only the body was seen. The mind was expected to endure in silence. The law saw him as a tool, not as a man. If he failed, he could be punished. If he succeeded, he was ignored. There was no reward for loyalty, only continuation of duty. He could not rise in rank. He could not leave his place. His future was not open. It was already written. Even when he tried to perform his work with mercy, society did not notice. A quick death was expected, not praised. A slow death was blamed. The best outcome was invisibility. To do well meant to vanish from memory. This made his effort meaningless in public eyes. Skill existed only to prevent chaos, not to earn honor, and so the executioner lived in a world where every path was narrow. He was needed but never welcomed, seen but never accepted. His work held society together through fear, yet he himself stood apart from the peace that fear was meant to protect. As time continued its slow movement forward, the executioner remained bound to a role he could not step away from. He did not carry a crown or a sword of power. He carried the end of the law's sentence, and in doing so, he carried the loneliness of a system that demanded death, but could not bear to look at it for long. As the executioner's years passed, the slow erosion of his place in society became more visible in the smallest details of daily life. Simple actions that others never thought about were filled with difficulty for him. Buying bread could become an uncomfortable moment. The baker might leave the loaf on the counter instead of placing it in his hands. Coins were dropped into a bowl rather than exchanged directly. These tiny gestures carried a clear message. He was tolerated, but not welcomed. Even when he paid like everyone else, he was treated as if his touch carried something dangerous. Festivals and holy days meant to bring communities together only deepened his separation. When bells rang for celebration, people filled the streets with music and color. The executioner stood at the edge of these gatherings, watching rather than joining. Children were pulled away from him. Adults lowered their voices. His presence reminded others of crime and punishment, and joy felt unsafe near him. Even in moments meant for happiness, he represented fear. The justice system continued to use him not only for death, but for visible suffering. Criminals were placed in stocks or pillories, and he was the one who locked them in. Whips and branding irons were his tools as well as swords. His hands shaped pain into a lesson for the crowd. The law said this pain would correct behavior. The people believed it would protect order. Yet all of it passed through him. He became the face of punishment, even though the decision was never his. This made his relationship with the condemned deeply strange. Prisoners feared him yet also depended on him. Some begged him for a quick death. Others cursed him as the one who would end their life. He heard final words meant for families, for God, or for no one at all. These words did not disappear when the body fell. They stayed with him. Each execution added another memory to a growing collection of last moments. No one asked him about these memories. No one wanted to hear them. The townspeople, however, were eager to see punishment, but not eager to think about its cost. They wanted the criminal removed. They wanted the lesson taught. But they did not want to think about the human effort involved in killing another person. By pushing the executioner away, they pushed away the reality of their own justice. He became a shield between society and its own violence. Superstitions continued to grow around him. Some believed that looking into his eyes could bring bad dreams. Others believed that touching his clothing could cause illness. At the same time, some secretly believed his tools held power. Pieces of rope, drops of blood, or wood from the gallows were sold as charms. These objects were thought to cure sickness, protect against evil, or bring strength. The executioner stood in the center of these beliefs, both feared and quietly sought after. His role became part of folk magic as much as law. When illness struck towns, the executioner was called again. He removed bodies from streets and houses. He carried the dead to burial grounds. In times of plague, his work doubled or tripled. People avoided him even more strongly then, fearing he carried disease as well as death. Yet they still needed him. He became a necessary figure in moments when fear was highest. Old age brought new dangers. Hands that once held weapons steady began to shake. Eyes that once judged distance grew tired. The executioner knew that one mistake could end not only a prisoner's life badly, but his own safety. Crowds did not forgive weakness. A failed execution could lead to stones and fists. Some towns replaced old executioners without warning. Others forced sons to take over before fathers were ready to stop. In this way, families were pushed forward into the same role again and again. The executioner's home remained a place of quiet endurance. Meals were eaten in small circles. Conversations stayed inside the family. Visitors were rare. News came through whispers and official orders. Children learned to read faces and moods because their safety depended on it. They learned when to be invisible and when to stand still. This training was not written in books. It was learned through daily experience of being different. Even dreams were shaped by the work. Sleep brought back images of crowds, ropes, and blades. Some executioners turned to drink to escape these thoughts. Others turned to prayer. Both were attempts to find peace in a life built around endings. There was no teacher for this kind of suffering. There was only habit. To live as a medieval executioner meant carrying the hidden cost of justice. While courts spoke of law and priests spoke of order, he carried the physical and emotional work of making punishment real. His life showed that the price of public justice was not paid only by the condemned, but also by the one who carried out the sentence. And as his days continued, marked not by festivals or harvests but by punishments and silence, the executioner remained what society made him. A man needed by law, feared by neighbors, avoided in joy, and remembered only in moments of death. His world was shaped by the scaffold, and his place in it was fixed beside it, standing in the shadow of the law, living a life that was itself a long and quiet sentence. As the executioner's life moved forward through seasons and years, the distance between him and ordinary people did not fade. Instead, it became part of the town's natural order. New children were born who already knew not to go near his house. New shopkeepers learned to serve him without touching his hands. New priests learned where he should sit in church. His place in society was taught as clearly as the rules of prayer or the prices of grain. He did not need to be reminded. Every look and every silence told him who he was. The executioner's work also placed him close to the darkest sides of human behavior. He saw crimes that shocked the town. He heard accusations of murder, theft, and betrayal. He witnessed fear and regret on the faces of those who stood on the scaffold. Over time, this shaped how he saw people. Trust became difficult. Kindness seemed fragile. He learned how quickly neighbors could turn against one another when fear or anger rose. This knowledge made him cautious in his own life. He spoke little and observed much, knowing that words could easily be twisted into trouble. His role in torture made this even harder. When courts demanded confession, the executioner became the one who applied pain. Prisoners cried out his name, not the judge's. They blamed him, not the law. This turned him into the enemy in their final memory. Even when he followed orders exactly, he carried the hatred of those he punished. Some families swore revenge against him. Others cursed his children. Living with this threat meant always being alert. Doors were locked tightly at night. Windows were barred. The executioner's home was not only isolated, it was guarded by fear. The tools he used also followed him into daily thought. A sword was not just a weapon, it was a reminder of duty. A rope was not just a rope, It was a sentence waiting to be used. These objects could not be forgotten or set aside. They had to be cleaned, sharpened, and stored. Their care was part of his routine, like prayer or sleep. The tools of death became as familiar as household tools, and this familiarity carried a quiet sadness. His craft was not to build or grow, but to end. When he passed through town streets, he saw how others lived. He saw families sharing food. He saw merchants laughing. He saw children playing. These scenes reminded him of what he could not fully join. Even when he stood close, he remained outside. His presence changed the mood of places. Laughter grew softer. Conversations paused. He became a moving boundary between normal life and the shadow of punishment. In some regions, executioners were given small privileges as compensation for their isolation. They might be allowed to collect certain taxes or keep the clothes of the executed. They might receive free firewood or grain. Yet these rewards did not bring dignity. They reminded everyone how he earned his living. Every coin he received came with the memory of blood. Wealth gained this way did not open doors. It only built higher walls around him. The emotional weight of the job deepened when he grew older. Younger executioners might see the work as a task to master. Older ones felt the accumulation of years. Each face joined a long line of memories. Each voice blended with others in his mind. Time did not erase these moments, it layered them. There was no ceremony to release this burden. There was no rest day for the soul. Only the next sentence, and the one after that. The executioner's children watched all of this. They saw how neighbors treated their father. They saw how doors closed when he passed. They learned not to speak of his work outside the house. They learned that their own futures were tied to it. Some grew angry, some grew quiet. All grew up early. Childhood was shorter in such a home. Awareness came too soon. Even when no executions were planned, the executioner remained tied to the prison and the court. He was called to prepare instruments, to inspect ropes, to test blades. He was called to witness sentences and receive orders. His life was linked to the law at every stage. Freedom from work did not mean freedom from its meaning. To live this life was to stand at the edge of society, touching it only when death was required. The executioner did not shape laws. He did not choose punishments. He only carried them out. Yet he bore the mark of everyone. The crimes of others became his daily labor. Their endings became his memories. And as the long story of his days continued, it became clear that the deepest wound of the profession was not the blood on his hands, but the distance placed around his life. He was made into a symbol rather than a neighbor, a function rather than a person. The town could not imagine justice without him, yet it could not imagine sharing a table with him either. So the executioner walked his path between scaffold and home, between law and loneliness, between necessity and rejection. His work kept order in the streets, but his life remained outside them. In serving death, he lost the simple right to belong among the living. As the executioner's life stretched on, the meaning of time itself changed for him. Ordinary people marked their years by harvests, weddings, and births. The executioner marked his by trials, sentences, and punishments. His calendar was written by the court. A long winter without executions meant hunger and worry. A sudden rise in crime meant danger and exhaustion. Peace brought poverty. Unrest brought risk. There was no season that brought true comfort. His relationship with authority was also filled with tension. Judges and town councils depended on him, yet they rarely defended him in public. If a crowd turned angry, officials stepped back. If a punishment went wrong, the executioner was blamed first. The law used him as its visible hand but did not protect him as its equal. In meetings, he stood rather than sat. He received orders rather than giving them. His role was fixed at the lowest edge of power, even while performing one of the system's most final acts. The executioner's body carried the signs of his work. Lifting heavy bodies, dragging prisoners, standing for long hours in cold and rain, and repeating violent motions damaged his joints and muscles. Cuts and bruises were common. Infections followed small wounds. Medical care was limited. Pain became part of daily life. A sore arm or weak leg was not an excuse to refuse duty. The sentence still had to be carried out. The crowd still had to see justice done. When illness struck him, fear grew sharper. A sick executioner meant delayed punishment. Delayed punishment meant unrest. Towns pressured him to work even when unwell. Fever or injury did not free him from duty. In this way, his body belonged as much to the law as his time did. His health was not his own. It was another tool of the system. The moral weight of the job pressed inward. Each execution forced him to confront the boundary between duty and cruelty. He knew that the law required him to act. He also knew that a human life ended by his hand. To survive this conflict, many executioners built emotional walls. They spoke little. They avoided forming close ties. Feeling too much made the work harder. Indifference became a shield. Yet this shield also cut him off from warmth and trust. The town's memory worked against him. People remembered the worst moments most clearly. A slow death. A scream. A broken rope. These moments were retold as stories long after they happened. Children heard them as warnings. Adults repeated them as proof of danger. The executioner's name became tied to these tales. Good executions were forgotten. Bad ones lived on. Even his acts of kindness were viewed with suspicion. If he helped a neighbor carry water or fix a fence, the help felt uncomfortable. People wondered what he wanted in return. They could not see him as simply human. His role colored every action. He was never just a man doing a favor. He was always the executioner doing something unusual. Travel offered no escape. Inns refused him. Villages closed doors. He slept near stables or outside walls. His reputation arrived before him. Letters and officials carried his name. The road did not lead away from his role. It only spread it wider. The prison was one of the few places where he was not avoided. There, fear replaced distance. Guards treated him with a mix of respect and unease. Prisoners stared at him with hatred or desperation. In these walls, he was fully himself, not as a man, but as a function. The law's end stood beside the law's beginning. His tools continued to define him. The sword hanging in his home was not decoration. It was a reminder that tomorrow could demand its use. The rope coiled in a corner was not just cord. It was a sentence waiting for breath. These objects made it impossible to forget his purpose. They filled his living space with silent threat. As years turned into decades, the executioner's world grew smaller. Fewer people spoke to him. Fewer places welcomed him. His life became a narrow path between scaffold and home. Everything else lay beyond reach. Dreams of other lives faded, possibilities closed one by one. And so, the true hardship of being a medieval executioner was not only in killing, but in being shaped entirely by killing. The job did not end when the blade was lowered. It followed him into sleep, into family life, into old age. It defined how others saw him and how he saw himself. In a society that believed in public justice and divine order, someone had to stand at the point where law became death. That someone was the executioner. He carried out the will of courts and crowds, yet lived as if under sentence himself. His punishment was not written on parchment. It was written into his days. As the executioner's life continued, the slow isolation of his position began to shape not only how others treated him, but how he understood himself. Over time, he stopped expecting welcome or kindness. He learned to move through the town as someone already judged. When he walked past homes, he did not look toward open doors. When he entered a market, he did not wait for greetings. His body language changed to match his place. Shoulders slightly lowered, eyes often down. A man trained not only in killing but in disappearing. The town depended on routine to feel safe, and the executioner was part of that routine. Crimes were announced, trials were held, punishments were scheduled. His presence marked the final step in a long chain of law. Yet in this chain, he stood at the weakest link. Judges could blame him if things went wrong. Guards could step away from him after the act. Priests could speak of sin and redemption while he stood silent beside them. Responsibility flowed downward and stopped with him. The role also changed how he saw justice itself. At first, he may have believed that punishment was fair and necessary. Over time, he saw patterns that troubled him. He noticed how poor men were punished more often than rich ones. He saw how confessions were forced through pain. He heard prisoners claim innocence in their final moments. These experiences did not give him power to change anything. They only gave him knowledge without voice. He learned that the law was not always balanced, but his hand still carried it out. His relationship with prisoners became one of the strangest parts of his life. Guards treated them as numbers. Judges treated them as cases. Priests treated them as souls. The executioner treated them as bodies that would soon stop breathing. In those last hours, he often became the closest human presence to the condemned. Some asked him for water. Some asked him for a quicker death. Some spoke of families they would never see again. These moments were not written in records. They lived only in his memory. After the punishment, he was left with silence. No one asked how it felt. No one cared whether his hands shook or his sleep was broken. The town moved on. Bread was baked. Fields were plowed. Children laughed again. Only the executioner carried the echo of the moment forward. His memory became a private graveyard of voices and faces. Even celebrations reminded him of his distance. Weddings, feasts, and holy days filled the streets with sound. Music played, wine was poured. Yet his presence always changed the air. People glanced at him and then looked away. Joy became careful. It was as if death had walked into the room. Not because he had killed that day, but because he always represented the possibility of killing. His very existence pointed toward punishment. As time passed, many executioners stopped trying to belong. They built their lives around small circles: family, tools, work, prayer. The world outside these circles felt hostile. Friendship with ordinary townsfolk was rare and fragile. One wrong moment could break it. One execution could undo years of quiet living. The fear of revenge also remained. Families of the condemned sometimes blamed the executioner personally. They believed he chose to kill, even when he only followed orders. Threats were whispered. Stones were thrown at windows. Fires were set near his home. Living under this fear meant sleeping lightly and watching shadows. His house became both shelter and prison. Old age did not bring relief. When his hands weakened, he feared the next sentence more than ever. A weak strike meant suffering. Suffering meant anger. Anger meant danger. Retirement was not guaranteed. Some towns dismissed old executioners without support. Others forced sons to take over while fathers still lived. A man who could no longer work lost his only place in society. Death itself did not promise peace. Many believed that an executioner's soul was stained forever. Some said he would be denied heaven. Others said he would walk among spirits of those he killed. These beliefs haunted him. He prayed more than others. He gave more than others. He feared judgment not from courts but from God. And so, the executioner lived a life shaped by endings. While others built, married, and planted, he prepared for final moments. His job was to close stories, not begin them. His reward was survival, not honor. His place was between justice and cruelty, carrying the weight of both. In the end, what made the life of a medieval executioner so hard was not only the act of killing, but the way society pushed all of its fear and guilt onto him. The town wanted order without blood on its hands. The executioner provided that order, and in doing so became the bearer of its darkest work. He was needed to make law real, yet condemned for doing so. His life became a living proof that in a world built on public punishment, someone had to stand where law and death touched. As the executioner's life moved toward its later years, the weight of everything he had done began to feel heavier than the tools he carried. His world was built from repetition. Another trial, another sentence, another body. Over time, this repetition did not make the work easier. It made it deeper. Each act added to a long chain of memory that could not be broken. While the town forgot old crimes, the executioner remembered them all. He remembered faces, voices, and the sound of crowds. These memories did not fade like ink on paper. They stayed close, returning in silence when the day's noise was gone. The town continued to rely on him, yet never truly claimed him. Laws changed, rulers changed, but his position did not. He remained outside guilds, councils, and families of respect. When disputes arose between neighbors, they did not invite him to speak. When celebrations were planned, they did not invite him to join. His role was not to belong. It was to appear only when order needed to be enforced. This made his life feel like a door that opened only for death and closed again afterward. Even his moments of rest were shaped by his work. When he sat by the fire, he did not hold farming tools or merchant scales. He cleaned blades and ropes. When he prayed for forgiveness more than for reward. When he slept, his dreams returned to the scaffold and the prison. Peace was never complete. It was always waiting to be interrupted by the next order from the court. The executioner's family shared this burden. His wife learned to live quietly. She avoided gatherings and spoke little in public. Her name carried the mark of his job. His children learned to hide their feelings and lower their eyes. They understood that their future was narrow long before they were old enough to choose it. School, trade, and marriage were all shaped by their father's role. They did not inherit land or honor. They inherited distance. In many towns, people believed that the executioner's presence could bring misfortune. If crops failed or sickness spread, whispers sometimes pointed toward him. His house became a place people avoided when they were afraid. This made him a target not only of law, but of superstition. He carried blame for things he could not control, simply because his work was linked to death. His relationship with power remained uneven. Lords and judges spoke to him when they needed him and ignored him when they did not. He stood close to authority but never shared it. He heard decisions, but did not make them. He enforced rules, but could not escape them. In this way, he lived beside power without holding any of it. As the years passed, his body grew slower and fear grew sharper. He knew that a mistake could turn the crowd against him. He knew that age could make his hand less steady. This fear followed him even on days without punishment. He watched his own movements carefully. He tested his strength. He worried not only about the condemned, but about himself. His survival depended on precision. When death finally came for him, it did not bring the honor given to soldiers or rulers. His burial was often quiet and separate. His grave did not stand among respected citizens. Even in death, the line between him and the rest of the town remained. Memory kept him in the place he had always lived, on the edge of society. Looking back at the life of a medieval executioner, it becomes clear that the true hardship was not only in performing executions, but in carrying the meaning of them. He was the living symbol of punishment. Through him, the law became visible. Through him, fear became real. Yet he paid the price for this role with his own place among the living. His story shows how justice in the medieval world depended on separation. Someone had to hold the blade so others could keep their hands clean. Someone had to stand on the scaffold so others could stand in safety. That someone was the executioner. He did not choose to be the face of death, but he became it. And so, as this history draws closer to its end, the executioner remains a figure shaped by contradiction. He served order but lived without belonging. He carried out sentences but lived under one of his own. His life was not defined by freedom or respect, but by necessity and endurance. In a world that demanded public punishment, he stood where law and death met, and in doing so, he lived a life that truly showed why it sucked to be a medieval executioner. As the executioner's life continued without pause, the slow change of towns and generations did nothing to change his place within them. New rulers arrived. New laws were written. New churches and walls were built. Yet his role remained the same. He stood outside the flow of ordinary life, tied to the same work his father had done, and his son would one day be forced to do. Progress passed around him like a river around a stone. The world moved forward, but he stayed fixed in the shadow of punishment. In times of peace, when crime was low, his presence became even more uncomfortable. People wondered why he still lived among them when there were no executions to perform. They saw him as a reminder of a threat that was not currently needed. His pay dropped. His food became poorer. He waited for sentences the way others waited for rain. Too much peace meant hunger. Too much crime meant danger. His survival depended on a balance he could not control. Courts continued to rely on confession rather than proof. When judges needed truth, they called for pain. The executioner prepared instruments of torture, not only weapons of death. Racks were tightened, irons were heated, whips were soaked in salt. These actions were ordered by law, yet the physical act belonged to him alone. Prisoners screamed his name, not the judges. This made him the face of suffering long before execution day arrived. Even those who were later found innocent remembered him as the one who hurt them. Public memory worked in cruel ways. A well-performed execution disappeared quickly from talk. A failed one became legend. Stories of slow deaths were told for years, growing larger with each telling. Children heard them as warnings. Adults repeated them as proof of danger. The executioner's name became tied to these stories not as a servant of the law but as a figure of cruelty. His identity was shaped by rumor more than by truth. There were moments when he tried to show that he was more than his work. He repaired fences, he helped lift heavy carts, he shared water with travelers. Yet each of these acts felt strange to others. They did not know how to receive kindness from the man who delivered death. A simple gesture carried confusion. Was it trick? Was it omen? His humanity made people uncomfortable because it broke the image they held of him. The church continued to struggle with his place in the world. Some priests said he served justice and should be forgiven. Others said his hands were stained no matter the reason. He attended services, but often sat apart. He prayed for mercy more than for blessing. He feared that when his life ended, he would meet not saints but the faces of those he had sent to death. Religion offered rules, but not peace. As his children grew older, the truth of inheritance became unavoidable. Sons were taught how to hold blades and tie ropes. Daughters were taught how to live quietly and accept rejection. The family name closed doors before they reached them. Education did not change this. Skill did not change this. Blood decided their path. The executioner did not pass on land or honor. He passed on a role that others refused. His home remained a place of careful silence. Visitors were rare. Conversation stayed inside walls. Laughter was soft. Life was lived inward rather than outward. While other families built ties with neighbors, his family built strength in isolation. Trust existed only inside the household. Outside, there was distance. Even clothing marked him. In some regions, special colors or signs identified his trade. These marks could not be removed easily. They followed him through streets and markets. People saw the symbol before they saw the man. His body carried a message before his words did. The physical work of punishment continued to wear him down. Lifting bodies, standing in cold squares, repeating violent motions damaged joints and muscles. There was no rest for this kind of injury. Pain became ordinary. Weakness became dangerous. Each execution demanded the same strength as the first, even when years had passed. His relationship with death became practical rather than emotional. He knew how bodies fell. He knew how long breath lasted. He knew how faces changed. This knowledge separated him further from ordinary life. While others feared death as an idea, he knew it as a process. This made him quiet among those who spoke of life lightly, and so his days continued, shaped not by choice but by necessity. The scaffold remained at the edge of town, and he remained beside it. Law needed him. Society rejected him. Between these two forces, his life moved forward without comfort or escape. He did not belong fully to the living world, yet he was not dead. He existed in a narrow space between justice and punishment, carrying out the will of others while living under a sentence that had no end. As the executioner's life moved on through changing seasons, the quiet distance between him and the rest of the town became something everyone accepted as natural. It was no longer argued about or explained. It simply existed. Children were taught to keep away. Shopkeepers learned how to serve him without touching his hands. Priests learned where he should sit. Even travelers who stayed only a night could sense that this man lived under different rules. The town did not need signs to mark him. Habit did the work. The justice system itself grew more complex, yet his position within it stayed simple and heavy. New crimes were written into law. New punishments were invented. Wheels, cages, and devices of restraint became more refined. But all of them still required one pair of hands to operate them. His hands. The law could change words on paper, but the body that carried out those words remained the same. Every new rule meant new ways of causing pain or death, and he had to learn them all. Courtrooms became places of waiting for him. He stood outside while judges spoke. He listened to sentences through doors or from the edge of the hall. When his name was called, it meant the end of discussion. Debate stopped where his duty began. This made him part of the process, yet never part of the decision. He walked the line between authority and obedience, visible but voiceless. Public anger often found its way to him even when crimes were not his fault. If theft rose, people demanded harsher punishment. If disease spread, they demanded stronger order. Each demand meant more work for him. When fear filled the streets, the executioner became the place where fear was released. Crowds did not shout at judges. They shouted at the scaffold, and he stood there hearing words meant for the world. In private moments, he saw how thin the line was between law and cruelty. He knew that one judge could spare a life while another ended it. He knew that wealth could change sentences and poverty could worsen them. Yet this knowledge gave him no power. It only deepened the weight of his role. He carried out outcomes he did not choose for reasons he could not question. Some executioners tried to bring small order to their own lives. They kept gardens behind their houses. They raised animals. They fixed tools and walls with care. These acts were attempts to build something in a life spent ending things. Yet even these small efforts did not draw neighbors closer. A fence built by his hands was still built by an executioner. A gift grown in his soil was still grown in cursed ground. Meaning was hard to plant in such soil. As towns grew larger, the distance between the executioner and the people did not shrink. It grew wider. In small villages, everyone knew everyone. In cities, people knew him only as a role. He became more of a symbol and less of a man. His face mattered less than his function. When masks were used, this became even clearer. The hood erased what little individuality remained. The job became a shape without a face. His family felt this change too. In larger towns, anonymity did not bring freedom. It brought stronger rules. Records were kept. Names were written down. Children of executioners were listed as such. Even if they moved, the paper followed them. This made escape nearly impossible. The law that used him also marked him. Work did not always come from crime alone. In times of political struggle, his role expanded. Rebels, prisoners of war, and accused traitors filled prisons. The executioner became part of larger conflicts he did not understand. His hands ended lives tied to power struggles far beyond his home. He did not know these people. He did not choose their fate. Yet he carried it out all the same. This made his world feel both small and vast at once. Small, because his daily path rarely changed. Vast, because the reasons for his work came from distant courts and unseen rulers. He stood where large forces touched human bodies. This made his life feel controlled by events far away and invisible. Even moments of rest were fragile. A knock on the door could mean another order. A bell in the square could mean another crowd. His life was always ready to turn back toward punishment. There was no true separation between work and home. The scaffold reached into his sleep. The longer he lived, the more his identity merged with his role. He did not introduce himself by name. He was introduced by function. The executioner. This title replaced family, history, and personality. It became the whole shape of his life. And so his days continued, shaped by laws he did not write and customs he could not break. He lived beside the gallows and beneath the shadow of judgment. While others measured life by growth and change, he measured it by repetition and endurance. His place in the town remained fixed, not by chains, but by belief. Between the crowd and the court, between fear and order, the executioner remained where he had always been, needed when death was demanded, forgotten when peace returned, living proof that justice in the medieval world required someone to stand where law met the body, and to stay there day after day without being allowed to step fully back into the world of the living. As the long story of the medieval executioner finally comes to rest, what remains is not the image of a powerful figure, but of a man trapped inside a role that no one else wished to carry. His life was shaped not by choice, but by necessity. Society needed punishment to be visible. Law needed death to be carried out. Fear needed a face, and that face became his. From the first day he took up the tools of his trade, the executioner stepped away from ordinary life. He did not farm, trade, or travel freely. He waited. He waited for courts to speak and for sentences to fall. His time belonged to the law, and his body belonged to its demands. When peace ruled, he lived in hunger and neglect. When unrest came, he lived in danger and hatred. There was no season of safety for him, only different kinds of hardship. His world was one of contradiction. He was trusted with the most final task, yet never trusted as a neighbor. He stood before crowds as the arm of justice, yet returned home as an outcast. Children feared him. Adults avoided him. Priests questioned his soul. Judges used his hands but did not share his burden. In this way, he became the place where society placed its violence, so that it would not have to see it in itself. The executioner did not write laws, he did not choose guilt, he did not decide mercy. He only carried out what others ordered, yet he carried the blame for it all. When punishment felt cruel, people blamed him. When death felt slow, people blamed him. When fear filled the square, people blamed him. The law hid behind him, and the crowd hid behind the law. Even his family lived inside this sentence. His children inherited his distance. His wife inherited his silence. Their names carried weight they did not choose. Doors closed before they reached them. Futures narrowed before they could imagine them. The scaffold stood not only in the square but in their lives. Old age did not free him. Weakness made him more afraid, not less. A shaking hand meant danger. A slow step meant anger. When he could no longer work, he did not become honored. He became forgotten. And when he died, his grave did not stand among respected men. Even in death, the space between him and society remained. Looking back across this history, the executioner's life shows something deep about the medieval world. Justice was public. Fear was useful. Order depended on suffering being seen. But the cost of this system was placed on one man's shoulders. His life became the price paid for the illusion of clean hands. To be a medieval executioner was not to live as a villain or a hero. It was to live as a necessity that no one wished to acknowledge. It was to stand where law became flesh and where words became death. It was to walk every day with the knowledge that one's purpose was to end, not to build. And so, as this history gently closes, the executioner remains a figure of quiet tragedy, a man who served justice but never joined society, a man who carried the weight of law but never shared in its protection, a man whose life itself became a sentence, lasting far longer than those he was ordered to carry out. The square grows silent. The crowd is gone. The scaffold stands empty. And the executioner's story fades into the long night of history, leaving behind the reminder that in every age when punishment is demanded, someone must bear the cost of delivering it.